Alright, how's it going? Welcome to the channel and welcome to a new series we're calling Techniques in 10. This is where we look at the fundamentals of various painting techniques in 10 minutes or less. Today we're going to talk about wet blending. Wet blending is essentially mixing paints on the model to create a transition between two or more colours. It's a technique I use a lot in my painting and one I'm quite fond of. So with that being said, let's get a timer and let's get into it. It may be helpful to use some retarder medium when learning how to wet blend, as this extends the drying time of your paint. We want to start with a damp brush, so wick away any excess water onto a paper towel. Please don't use your good brushes for this technique. It is easier to blend paints within the same hue, i.e. blending red with red, blue with blue, green with green, and so on. As you can see, we are applying one colour, drawing it out, and then applying the colour we wish to transition to. We work these paints together to create a gradient on the surface instead of on the palette. When creating these gradients, don't be afraid to add more paint if you feel the colours are getting lost. We can use wet blending to shade colours by using black or another dark tone. You can quickly overpower your colours using black, so it's better to start small and add more as needed. The same is true for tinting colours, where you add white. Again, you can quickly overpower the colour, so it is better to start small. You can wet blend with complementary colours, but when you do this, you will get a muddy, desaturated colour when transitioning. At times this will work, it just depends on the finish you want to achieve. And again, black and white works just fine, but it takes some extra back and forth to get a smooth transition. Using black and white is great for pre-shading, establishing volumes, and creating value contrast, which we will look at now. First we apply a layer of black over the leg and the foot. Using white, we pick out the highlights and create transitions by working the paints together. Doing this creates a mix of the colours on the brush, which we can use to smooth out the transitions. While the paint is still wet, we can come back with some more white to emphasise the highlights. And this is how I would create a quick value sketch using wet blending. When it comes to working with paints of the same hue, I apply the darker colour first to a majority of the area, focusing in the shadows or in the recesses. Using the brighter highlight colour to pick out the raised areas, working these paints together to create a transition. Don't worry if these sections look rough or the coverage isn't perfect. You can always come back and repeat the process to improve the coverage and smooth out sections. Applying 2 layers of base coat will not affect the detail of the model. Just quickly repeating the process from before to smooth out the transitions and get a more even coverage. We can reinforce the shadows by shading the darker red using black. First we apply the dark red, and taking a small amount of black we place it in the deepest recess, pulling it out. Then going back in with the red, I smooth out the step between the 2 colours. I wanted to clean up my highlight from earlier, so grabbed some more of the bright red and went over the raised section. This gives you a quick demonstration of how you can wet blend with more than 2 colours to create a transition. Doing this has allowed us to create a bigger value step and emphasise the contrast. Using the same process, we can create highlights by tinting colours using white. First apply the blue all over the area, then take a small amount of white and place it where we want the brightest point of the highlight to be, pulling it back into the blue to create a gradient. Applying some more blue to smooth out the transition. Finally adding a bit more white just to make the highlight pop. Now I want to cover some of the gotchas or some of the common mistakes that you normally see when wet blending. Ensure you're using the right primer or undercoat for your colour. Paints with low pigmentation or saturation will need multiple coats and may look blotchy over black. So think about using grey or white to prep the area before wet blending. Another common issue is overworking your paint. Once the paint starts to dry, you need to stop working it. Continuing to do so can create rips and tears in your paint, and then you'll have to go back and start over. This can also add some unwanted texture and distract from the overall finish. I've exaggerated the effect here, where you can see the paint is pulled away from the model and gathered at the edges. Lastly, we have overthinning. This is when you've added too much water, medium, or retarder to your paint. There's not enough pigment to create a saturated mix, and it will appear that you're glazing the area instead of wet blending, as you'll be unable to create a visible transition between the 2 colours. So that covers the fundamentals of wet blending. It does take a wee bit of practice, but I definitely recommend you give it a go. If you have any comments or questions or things you would like to see in the future, please drop them below in the comments, and until next time. Hopefully you found this useful. Don't forget to like and subscribe.